State management is one of the most important topics to understand. Like we talked about previously, state is just data. And a lot of an application is just displaying and manipulating that data. And it can get real messy and out of control without state management. So, state management is the theory about how you control your data within your application. And there's two specific things that state management needs to do. One is manage and manipulate the data, and two, let the UI know when it needs to be updated because the data has changed. Now, Flutter actually has some solutions to this, specifically one that we've actually run into before, and that is set state. Set state is the simplest state management within a Flutter application, but set state by itself only lets you manage the data within a specific widget. But Flutter also provides you a way to use it and manage data throughout a whole application, and that's using something called inherited widget. Now, a definition of inherited widget is a base class for widgets that efficiently propagate information down the tree. Basically, it allows you to give data to the widgets below it in the widget tree. So if you maybe add an inherited widget all the way up here, all these widgets below it will be able to have access to that data if needed. The thing is, inherited widget isn't actually used that much. We're going to actually walk through an example of how to use inherited widget and how you would use it if you had to, but it's very verbose. Most developers actually use some sort of state management package. This we'll cover a lot deeper with one package in specific. The reason you use a state management package is because it does the same exact thing, but it simplifies it a little bit. But not just this, but some packages add some actual nice features to make sure you're always checking out all the cases, whether it's errors or loading, and gives you easy access to update the UI. There are a ton of packages out there. They all pretty much accomplish the same thing, so feel free to choose and work with one that you enjoy. The one we're going to be working with is RiverPod in the next lesson. But before we get to that, we're going to go through an example of an application that I built with inherited widget itself. Now in this lesson, we're not going to write out the actual code. What I want to teach here is the actual theory and the basics of how a state management package works. And I think in the next lesson, when you go through it, where we actually go deeper into every part, you'll see a lot of similarities that we see here. And maybe if you don't understand everything the first time going through this lesson, after checking out the next two where we use a package, you can come back to this and you'll see how Flutter implements it by default. And so what we're going to be doing there is turning this counter that we have into an app state. And it might maybe even seem unnecessary, but at the end, I will show you what this allows us to do. So, we said there's two main goals with state management. First is dealing with the data. In order to deal with the data, we have to define the data first. So this is the app state of our whole application. And you'll notice it's just the counter that we have. This is the state that we're going to be managing throughout this video. And below it, we have our inherited widget that we will be using. We create a class and we named it provider because it's going to be providing information or data to the rest of our application. Our next part we said is we need to insert this at the top of our widget tree in order to be able to propagate that data down. So we go to our main file. At the very top, you'll see we have defined an app state holder. If we jump into this app state holder, you see at the bottom it has a provider in it. So this provider is the inherited widget that will be passing down this specific data throughout the rest of our widget tree. And we created this app state holder to actually manage that data. So up here, we initialize the data, and we have one function that we add to it called add, where it lets us increment that specific data. And you'll notice we call set state to update the rest of our application that this data has changed, and anything using this data needs to update as well. And finally, we get to displaying this data. You'll see we call provider.ofContext. So this context goes up our widget tree, finds the provider, and returns the counter that we have for it. And to increment, we get the app state holder, which had the functions where we can add and increment the counter that we had and see that change here. Now let's stop for a second and what the heck are we even doing here? You can see the counter works the same exact way, but we just went through that whole headache of setting up this whole state management solution just to have the counter work the same way. Why? Well, there's something very special we can do now. This state isn't tied to this one screen. We actually have the second page, which in other applications that we built, the second page, it starts from scratch. But here, the state is actually saved. Not only that, we can update this state from our second screen, and if we go back, you see it's updated here as well. This might not seem that powerful when we're doing it with a counter, but when we're going to be doing this with actual user information, if you go into some screen where you want to update a username or something, you update it there, and it gets updated throughout our app wherever it's used. So that's one of the big power features of state management. You get to use state throughout your whole application. And the second big power of it is that it's organized. So let's say for some reason our counter is not working right here. We actually wanted to increment our counter by 2 instead of 1. And not just that, we want the same thing on both pages. Normally, we probably have defined it in 2 places. We'd be passing it around and we have to update our function twice. But we'll know everything's organized. The only way that our state gets updated is through the functions defined here. So all we need to do is update this from +1 to +2, save it, and it gets incremented by 2 on the first page. If we go to the second page, same thing happens. Now imagine, as your app gets bigger, you have tens or hundreds of data pieces scattered everywhere, and you have tens or hundreds of different ways to manage that data. You will know exactly where that data is defined, where it gets updated, and it's all in one place here. Maybe you run into a problem somewhere, you need to fix it. You know exactly where to go to fix that problem. Now in the next couple lessons, we're going to build out the same application, except using a state management package. We're building it out from scratch. We're going to cover all the concepts we covered here, except the code's going to be a little bit simpler and easier to understand. And if you're curious, you can come back after those lessons and see how to do it with just the inherited widget and set state. And hopefully at that point, it'll all click and make sense.